I'm going to talk about the Winter War. As you can see, I am dressed appropriately for the weather today. However, I want to kind of give the impression of the general idea, along with the mannequin over there, of what the Finns were wearing. Now, this was very important to the Winter War, but sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about the Winter War first. The Winter War was, to put it briefly, after Finland had gained their independence, they had a bit of a border conflict with the Soviets. The Soviets were not really happy, as you saw after the revolution and then the interwar years. The Soviets were really interested in taking back all of the land that the Russian Empire had. They took over the Baltic states, they went into Western Asia, so on, Caucasus, and so on. A lot of fledgling republics were then brought back into the fold. Finland was one of the few that was able to withstand the initial advances, and that eventually led to the Winter War, where the Soviets asked that the Finns move their border farther away from Leningrad because it was too close, and the Finns were like, no, not going to do that. That's most of our territory. And leading up to that, what happened was there was a lot of talks. The Finns were really trying, there was kind of a divide between pro-war and anti-war forces. Some people didn't see the Finnish military as ready within the government, and some people were like, well, we're going to just fight the Russians. They're going to attack us anyway. We've seen what they've done throughout the world, so what we're going to end up doing is fight them. So in the winter of 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. They said it was the Finns were aggressive. They said that the Finns shelled their positions alongside their border, and the Finns were like, no, you didn't do that. The Soviets claimed that they did, and they used that as a pretext for invasion. The Winter War was a horrific war for both sides. The Soviets lost a lot of manpower to the war, the biggest factor being that they were not prepared for the war. They did not think very highly of the Finns. They thought that they could just walk through them. And they wore their brown uniforms, they weren't ready for winter, they didn't have the right kind of, they did not plan for it to be a prolonged actual operation. They just thought they would just walk in and the Finns would surround them. They're horribly wrong. The Finns caused quite a bit of casualty to the Soviet side. I don't remember the exact numbers. Does anyone remember?
It was about, the Finnish military was about 98,000. I think the total Russian manpower, all support equipment, is about 2 million, roughly.
Right. Wow.
It's like 2.1.
2.1 million. Okay. So those numbers, 98,000 to 2.1 million, quite a difference between the two. However, the Finns were able to utilize their snow camo, their hardiness in the winter years that, weirdly enough, the Russians were not prepared for. But I leave that to the logistical problems that the Soviets had, and not the individual soldier. But this led to a bunch of individuals doing extraordinary things, such as Simo Haya, who was a sniper who got over 500 confirmed kills without a scope. He eventually would get wounded, but he would survive the war and he would live on until the 90s?
2002, I think.
Yeah.
2002? Yeah, he lived quite a long while. He was wounded horribly with an exploding bullet, which was supposed to be illegal, but apparently it doesn't count. Then going back to the original, going back to the disparity between the two forces and how lacking in manpower Finland was, they were also lacking in a lot of anti-tank equipment. This is where I'm going to talk about the Molotov cocktail, which is important, and then we're going to probably continue on. But this is probably one of the bigger known things. This and Simo are the two well-known things about the Winter War. Finland, not able to get anti-tank weaponry, had to improvise, and what they ended up doing was they created the Molotov cocktail. That gets its name from very early on in the war. The Soviets went on the radio to the people of Finland. They said that they were coming to liberate them. They were sending planes over their cities to drop bread and whatever they needed for the hungry Finnish citizens, who they were portraying as starving and under the oppression of the Finnish democratic Republican government. And they said that they were going to provide food to make them look good on the international stage. Turns out they dropped firebombs instead on civilian populace, and it's one of the most horrible things it's one of those horrible things that you just read about World War II in general. It's just an awful time frame, to be honest. And the Finns, with their, I would say it's their personality and their humor, were like, well, they said they were going to drop bread. They called the firebombs Molotov bread baskets, and they thought it would be only fitting as hosts to bring the drink. So they brought the Molotov cocktail to this party that the bread was being dropped for. So they designed these firebombs to work against Soviet tanks. I actually have a real life little tank here to show it off, but I'm going to just walk around a little bit to show it off. But so the Soviets had really big exhaust vents on the back. I don't know if everyone could see it, but what the Finns would end up doing is they would take a Molotov cocktail, which these are storm matches, which when you think of Molotov cocktail, you think of like a rag on top of wrapped around a bottle. These ones were the original design, and they would light the match and they would throw it into the back. And because the Soviets were geniuses with their tank design, they're like, let's warm the crew cabin with the exhaust from the engine. So when you throw a Molotov cocktail in there, then then it explodes the engine, and then all of that goes right into the crew cabin and sets everyone on fire.
Yep.
The Soviets eventually caught on, and Molotov cocktails would eventually lose out in popularity after the Winter War, for sure. But the war would eventually end with the Soviet victory. They paid a heavy price for it. The land that was taken would eventually lead up into the continuation war, which will be talked about next. But this lays the seed for the rest of World War II for Finland. But Finland, their history with World War II is much different than most other nations. They end up fighting 3 wars, Winter War being the first, and we will go on into the next 2. But they really did just fight against everyone, it seems, throughout that history. And after the Winter War ended, Finland lost their land. They were in a very desperate situation. However, the international community would come together in many interesting ways to help this poor nation against the behemoth as the Soviet Empire. And there are American organizations, Western European organizations were created to help Finland, and Neil will talk more about that.